Hi, welcome to the video. For the impatient people out there, I've broken up this video into 3 different segments: history, process, and future. They each have their own timestamps in the description if you want to skip ahead and check those out. To know about the future of energy, we first need to learn about the past. Every source of energy has their own highs and lows in terms of invention and expansion throughout our world. Using wind as a source of power is something that us as humans are very accustomed to. For thousands of years, we've used wind to sail rivers and oceans. However, it wasn't until the 1st century AD that the first wind-driven wheel was created by a Greek engineer by the name of Heron of Alexandria. For the next few centuries, the wind-driven wheel was being spread around the known world by the interconnected trade routes of each civilization. By the 7th and 9th century, the wind wheel was being used in eastern regions of Iran and Afghanistan, and by the 11th century, wind wheels were being used in China and Sicily. Finally, the wind wheel reached northwestern Europe by around the 1180s. Although the wind wheel being transported around the known world was a massive accomplishment, the main use of these wind wheels were to grind food like corn and flour and to pump water. From that point in the 1180s, there was not much more development in terms of wind power. The reason for this was simple. There was no need for more advancement. People didn't have a need for more power to be generated, so no one really tried to advance technology. This all changed during the 1800s though. And what caused a sudden shift to advance the technology? The Industrial Revolution. There are many reasons for the Industrial Revolution and why it happened. However, I won't talk about it now. Maybe in a future documentary. The first known wind turbine that produced electricity was built in Scotland. This wind turbine was built by Professor James Blyth, who used this wind turbine to power his home. This inadvertently made Professor Blyth's home the first ever to be powered by electricity coming from a wind turbine. He actually generated so much electricity he had a surplus. He offered this surplus to his local village, but they actually rejected the offer. The people there thought that electricity was the work of the devil. From this point in history, there was a major need for power, and in later years, clean power that did not use coal, oil, or natural gas. So wind power grew very quickly. By 1891, a Danish scientist and a very important person when it comes to the beginning of wind power, Paul Lacour, developed an electricity generating wind turbine and created a regulator to provide a steady stream of power. By 1908, there were 72 electricity generating wind turbines throughout Denmark. The success of wind power was not just in Europe, but in the United States. People were using wind turbines to power lights as early as 1927. Over the course of the next couple of decades, the advancement of technology was centered around making more efficient and stronger wind turbines. I think you can see how much progress we were making by seeing a timeline of how many homes in the United States could be powered by wind farms. This increase is dramatic, as it continues to grow to this day, not just in the United States, but around the entire world. Similar to wind energy, humans have spent centuries trying to use the power of the sun as a source of energy. A lot of civilizations used a set of mirrors and the power of the sun to light fires and increase the size of a fire. However, the type of solar power I will be talking about in this video is from photovoltaic solar cells. This story starts in 1839 when a French physicist, Edmond Becquerel, discovered the photovoltaic effect. For a couple decades after the discovery, there was no progress on solar power. But in 1876, William Grylls Adam and Richard Evans Day applied the photovoltaic effect to selenium and found that selenium could generate electricity when exposed to light. Just a few years later, in 1883, Charles Fritts created the first working selenium solar power cells. This type of power cell was actually a precursor to the modern silicon solar cells we use today. It wasn't until Albert Einstein published a paper on the photoelectric effect that more people became interested in solar power. This paper was published in 1905, but there really wasn't another big leap in solar power until 1954. Then, in 1954, 3 scientists, Gerald Chaplin, Calvin Fuller, and Gerald Pearson, created the silicon power cell we use today. The first solar cells they created, though, were not that efficient, only being about 4% efficient. However, when the 3 scientists released their findings, they had made solar cells with 11% efficiency. From this point, the majority of the research and findings were found by the United States government. During the space race of the 1950s and 1960s, both the United States and the Soviet Union used solar panels on their satellites. And during the 1970s Arab oil embargo, the United States government was determined to find a source of energy that they could use domestically so that the United States wasn't as dependent on foreign oil. From the 1970s on, the government enacted legislation to help improve public viability for solar panels. The price per watt dropped from $100 to $20 in the 1970s, and even dropped as low as 50 cents per watt nowadays. The government also created tax incentives to allow ordinary people to have access to solar panels on their homes. Also, over time, the efficiency of solar panels had actually increased from 11% to about 15 to 18% depending on what panel you get. Throughout the 21st century, there has been a substantial increase in the number of solar panels. We were at about 100,000 total installations in 2010, and we reached 1 million in 2016 and reached 2 million in 2020. Compared to the two previous sources of energy we've talked about, nuclear energy has nowhere near the same longevity in our daily lives. Truth is, the main component to nuclear energy, uranium, wasn't discovered until 1789 by Martin Klaproth. This, relative to the longevity of wind or solar power, should mean that nuclear energy should be far less accepted and used in our daily lives. However, this isn't the case. Part of the reason nuclear energy is used and accepted so widely in our society is because of its history. After the discovery of uranium, there weren't many advancements in terms of nuclear power. For nearly a century, there was no need to advance because of the Industrial Revolution and the abundance of non-renewable resources. However, starting in 1895 and going through to 1939, scientists and chemists like Wilhelm Röntgen, Henry Becquerel, Pierre and Marie Curie, and Ernest Rutherford discovered radioactivity and the nature of the atom. With so many discoveries, finally in 1939, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann were able to prove that nuclear fission was possible and had occurred in a laboratory setting. Then around the same time, Lea Meitner and Otto Fritz found that energy was produced every time nuclear fission occurred. They even calculated how much energy was produced: 200 million electron volts. However, with the start of World War II, all research into nuclear energy was almost strictly for developing nuclear weapons. Although this research was good for the advancement of nuclear energy. With the development of atomic weapons, scientists were able to understand precisely why nuclear reactions worked and what materials were best to use to generate the most energy. World War II and the Cold War brought massive advancements in nuclear energy. And by the 1950s, the world was ready to experiment with nuclear reactors to produce electricity. The Cold War was part of the reason nuclear energy was so sought after for energy production, especially in the United States. In 1953, President Eisenhower proposed his program, Atoms for Peace, to generate more effort to gain nuclear energy from bomb making to electricity producing. And during the 1950s and 1960s, nuclear generators were being built in most places around the world. However, apparent nuclear meltdowns during the 1970s and 1980s at the 3 Mile Island power plant and Chernobyl caused the public to lose their trust in nuclear energy. This burnout and mistrust of nuclear energy continued to around 2002, and then a new wave of nuclear reactors were being built in Asia. This increase in nuclear power can even be seen today in other parts of the developing world, like India. Unlike the previously mentioned nuclear power, hydroelectric power has been around for many centuries and in many different forms. It's difficult to establish where hydroelectric power was first being produced because the technology was so easily accessible to ancient civilizations. However, it is known that the Greeks and the Chinese were using some form of hydroelectric power to grind grain and saw through wood 2,000 years ago. For around 1,800 years, barely any progress is being made to advance hydroelectric power. However, in 1849, James Francis developed a modern water turbine similar to the ones we use today. And this is really the big difference in hydroelectric power compared to other energy sources. Although there have been advancements in other types of turbines used, the Francis turbine is still the same model we use today. Whereas with other energy sources, people are constantly creating better and better ideas. With the creation of the Francis turbine, it only took a couple of decades for people to start to develop the first hydroelectric dams. The first was in Northumberland, England, which powered a single lamp, but was quickly privatized and adopted to serve multiple customers in Wisconsin. Over the next couple of years, there were multiple dams built. Grand Rapids, Michigan, Ottawa, Ontario, Niagara Falls, New York were the start, and by the 1900s there were dams in Germany, China, and Australia. Interestingly, by 1920, hydroelectric power actually accounted for 25% of the total United States electricity generation. And with President Roosevelt's New Deal plan to bring the United States out of the Great Depression, more and more dams were built throughout the United States. This includes one of the most famous dams in the world, the Hoover Dam, which finished construction in 1936. And even in the midst of World War II, the electricity produced by dams was used to make airplanes and ships. For the next couple of decades, more and more dams were built in the developing world. Places like Brazil, Paraguay, and China continued to build more and more dams to improve their production. However, in the 1980s and 1990s, fundings for dams actually started to dry up when people started to see the environmental consequences of dams being built all over the place. For those decades, people constantly assessed the risk of building dams and determined it was more favorable to use other sources of energy, like wind power. And since then, people have built new dams and reignited the future of hydroelectric power. Learning the history of the different sources of energy is very important to understanding what the future of energy on Earth can be. By learning where we're at in terms of technology, we can actually see what the future can hold. But to actually see what the future can hold, we first need to know how every source of energy operates. To operate a wind turbine is actually fairly simple. This is part of the reason why we've used wind energy for thousands of years. But if we want to talk about how wind power actually works, we first need to understand kind of what wind is. Wind is actually, funny enough, a form of solar energy. Wind is caused by a couple of different factors. First, the uneven heating of the Earth. Second, the differences in height on the Earth's surface. And lastly, the rotation of the Earth itself. I won't be going into specifics on how this concept actually works because it's something we should all know about, something we all learned in high school. But those are the three main reasons why wind is actually made on Earth. With this understanding of why wind happens on Earth, we can also see the most consistently windy areas of Earth. With that out of the way, there are two types of main wind turbines. The most popular one being the horizontal axis turbine. This turbine is what most people think about when they talk about wind turbines. Generally, this type of turbine has 2 or 3 blades and works upwind, or in other words, the turbine faces into the wind. The second type of turbine is the vertical axis turbine. This type of turbine comes in a variety of different styles, but the most common style is the egg beater style Darius model. Interestingly, vertical axis turbines don't face a specific direction in order to operate. Although there are just 2 main types of turbine, each and every wind turbine has a different application and usage. The most common application is land-based turbines. These turbines are generally built big because they are more cost effective and are grouped together with other wind turbines into wind farms. There are also offshore wind turbines, which are massive and generate a lot more power. Some of the offshore turbines are even bigger than the Statue of Liberty, and there aren't usually any transportation problems because we can just use ships to bring these behemoths out to the ocean. The last type of application is distributed wind. This type is more customer based though. They tend to be a lot smaller and operate as part of the hybrid system so that the customer can still have power on less windy days. Now that we understand the different types of turbines and their applications, we can talk about the turbine itself. And believe it or not, there's actually a fair amount of science and physics that goes into making a turbine. First, the blades. As the wind blows, the blades spin. It's simple. However, the blades are constantly made more and more efficient and aerodynamic so that less wind is needed to push the blades. The blades turn a low-speed shaft that turn about 30 to 60 RPM. Any lower, the turbine actually wouldn't generate any electricity, and any faster, the turbine can actually break. The next step is for the rotations of the low-speed shaft to turn a gearbox. The gearbox actually increases the rotations from 30 to 60 RPM all the way to 1000 to 1800 RPM. This is so that the generator can actually generate electricity. After this, the increased rotations of the gearbox produce electricity within the generator and the energy is sent to be used. But there are some scientific instruments on the wind turbine, like the anemometer, that determines the wind speed and sends information to the controller, which in turn determines if the wind is too low or too high and turns off the turbine accordingly. The controller and the pitch system also worked in tandem to ensure the safety of the turbine. We just finished talking about wind energy, perhaps the simplest form of energy. Now we can talk about probably the most complicated form of energy, solar power. Although solar panels use the sun as their source of energy, sunlight doesn't directly cause the panels to produce electricity. What actually produces the electricity inside the solar panels are thousands of silicon cells inside of each solar panel. Let me explain a little further. As photons, otherwise known as particles of light, hit each silicon cell, the cell releases electrons. This release generates electricity in small amounts. 2 silicon cells make up what is called a photovoltaic cell. The photovoltaic cell actually has a small electric field surrounding it because of how the cell moves when the electrons are released. To create the electric field, the top silicon cell is seeded with phosphorus, which takes away electrons, creating a negative charge, and the bottom silicon cell is seeded with boron, which gives electrons, creating a positive charge. The electric field uses positive and negative charge to push the released electrons onto a metal wire. This metal wire then transports the electricity to an inverter. This is because the energy created is DC and is incompatible with most homes that use AC. Once converted, the power is ready to be used within the home. Interestingly, on sunny days or low periods of energy use, you can actually give the excess energy made from the solar panels back to electric companies. In return, you receive credit for that power that you use on bad weather days or at night. This brings on a major incentive to get solar panels because of the reduced cost of electricity. To ensure safety, solar panels are covered in glass and insulation which protects the photovoltaic cells so that they don't get too wet or too hot. I do find it kind of funny though that the cells need this insulation because the hotter a cell gets, the less efficient they are. And with already having low efficiency, this really could be like a downfall. The only type of energy that could match the complexity that solar panels have would be nuclear energy. This complexity is also part of the reason why it took nuclear energy so long to actually develop. But with the Second World War and the Cold War, the technology advanced really quickly due to demand and need for nuclear weapons. In essence, nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons work off a base system of nuclear fission, or the process of breaking down a more complex element into two smaller elements. However, I can't talk too much about nuclear weapons unless I want free 24-hour surveillance around my house by some black vans. I think we can talk about the nuclear reactors though, right? Right? Technically, we need to talk about nuclear fission and how that works before we can talk about nuclear reactors. So, what is nuclear fission? Nuclear fission is the main process behind nuclear power. All you do with nuclear fission is split an atom. The bigger the atom, the easier it is to split. That's why we use uranium, which has the biggest atom of any natural resource. By splitting the atom, it generates heat and expels more neutrons from the nucleus. These neutrons hit other uranium atoms, which cause more and more heat to be produced. This is what we call the nuclear chain reaction, and it's the main process behind nuclear reactors. Now that we know how nuclear fission works, we can talk about the reactors. There are two main types of reactors in the United States: the pressurized water reactor, or PWR, and the boiling water reactor, or BWR. Both reactors kind of work the same. They both push water into the reactor and use that water to generate steam to then turn the turbine to produce electricity. The main difference is whether or not the water is directly put into the control rods or kept separate. I should note here that the control rods are connected to the uranium fuel source. Around 2/3 of the reactors in the United States are pressurized water reactors. This type of reactor actually keeps the water separate from the control rods and is cleaner. The water is simply heated in a tank and then recondensed back into usable water after the steam passes through the turbine. The last third of reactors are boiling water reactors, which directly puts the water into the control rods and allows that to heat up the water directly. The water is also recondensed back into use for the reactor, but this water can still have traces of radioactivity because they come in contact with the control rods. Although to this point we've talked about some really interesting concepts and processes about each type of source of energy, but I think the most interesting is hydroelectric power. This may seem a little confusing because hydroelectric power is just falling water. But there are a couple of different types of hydroelectric power plants that are intriguing in how they work. Let me explain before you type in the comments that nuclear power is the most interesting. Please. Please. First, I do have to say this. Hydroelectric power is just simply moving water that flows through a turbine that generates electricity. There's not much more than that. But there are a couple of different types of hydroelectric power plants. And I should clear up this misunderstanding. Not all dams are hydroelectric power plants. Dams are used for a variety more things, including irrigation, travel, and flood control. A dam isn't a hydroelectric power plant, but a hydroelectric power plant can be a dam. Currently, there are about 80,000 dams in the United States, but only about 2,400 actually produce power. There are two main types of hydroelectric dams. The first and most common one is impoundment. This is the conventional dam with turbines inside of it. The water is stored in a reservoir behind the dam and released when electricity is needed. The second type is diversion or run-of-river hydroelectric plants. This type is connected to pre-existing rivers or canals and takes in a portion of water to produce power. Diversion hydroelectric power plants don't actually use dams, but can sometimes require a partial blocking of the river or canal. Hydroelectric power plants aren't always used constantly with free-flowing water. A lot of the time, hydroelectric power plants are used similar to batteries. During times of high usage, the plant will open up and allow water to move freely and generate power, and during times of low usage, the water is pumped back up to the reservoir. This actually causes hydroelectric power plants to work at a net negative when they pump the water back up, meaning they use more electricity than they actually produce. However, the reason we still do this is because it's more efficient to. During a hot day, you can open up a hydroelectric power plant for 8 hours and generate enough electricity for the people to use. Then at night, you can use power from a nuclear power plant to pump the water back up. This uses less electricity overall, even if your plant originally works at a net negative. I know this documentary was about the energy on Earth, and I still haven't talked about coal, oil, or natural gas. But the reason why I chose to do this is because the future of energy is wind, solar, nuclear, and hydroelectric. Non-renewable resources of energy can only last so long, whether we run out of the materials we use or we end up killing the planet. So one day in the future, we'll actually be forced to use other sources of energy, and honestly, this revolution, as some people call it, has already begun. In 2019, the United States renewable energy resources passed coal in terms of consumption for the first time. Obviously, this isn't as big of a win as you would expect because you have to combine every source of renewable energy just to reach the consumption of coal energy. However, coal consumption has actually been on the decline for the past 6 years, and since coal is mainly used for electrical production, this is still a pretty big win. This advancement in renewable sources of energy isn't just in the United States, it's worldwide. In 2013, again for the first time, renewable energy capacity increased more than new plants that burn fossil fuels. And in places like Germany, over 35% of their power is produced from renewable sources of energy. And on a good day in Denmark, they actually produce 140% of their energy needs with just wind energy. That's insane. Although when we look to the past, it doesn't really seem like we're making much progress. In 1920, hydroelectric power produced 25% of the total United States power. Nowadays, it's just barely 7%. This doesn't seem good, but even though we've seen an exponential increase in renewable energy production, need for electrical energy has risen even more. And with the abundance and cheapness of non-renewable sources, renewable energy has taken a long time to grow. However, this is changing. It's incredible to see the massive increase in renewable energy over just the past 2 decades. Tax breaks, environmental reasons, and advancements in technology have caused an almost exponential increase in renewable energy consumption and production. The United States could even be considered a little behind some other places around the world. Like I said, Germany produces 35% of its power from renewable energy, and places like China have doubled the installed wind capacity and percent of domestic hydroelectric power generation. But this doesn't mean the United States doesn't produce a lot of renewable energy. 11% of the energy consumed in the United States is from renewable energy, and when we add nuclear sources, it goes up to 19%. When you look at a chart or graph or forecast for renewable energy in the future, it can be really overwhelming. I mean, almost all of them show an exponential increase in renewable energy, and us as humans can't quite fully comprehend how much that increase is once it gets to a certain point. And plus, the different numbers almost seem too good. I will admit it's impossible to predict the future, but people are doing their best they can. And the numbers you see a lot of the time aren't going to be far off if we continue at the pace we're at. The big word there is if. As of right now, about 26% of the entire world's electricity is generated by renewable sources. And by 2024, that number is actually expected to reach 30%. From 2019 to 2024, renewable energy capacity is actually expected to expand by 50%. Those are both massive numbers. And there's really one main cause to this massive increase: solar power. Solar power in its current form is really new. Like we found out earlier, the solar panels we use today weren't made until 1954. But since that point, solar energy has grown a lot. And in the 2010s, solar energy was the fastest growing source of renewable energy. The United States is actually projected to double its solar installation to 4 million by 2023. And the price of solar power is supposed to go down by 15 to 35% by 2024. This will let more people have access to solar panels. Solar power isn't the only source of energy that is expected to grow. Wind energy will continue to grow as well, but not necessarily the traditional wind turbines. Offshore wind turbines are expected to grow by 57% by 2024. Actually, by 2024, 10% of the total wind energy produced will be by offshore turbines, and that number is just expected to grow. In 2024, hydroelectric power is projected to still be the world's main source of renewable energy, but the capacity will only have increased by 9%. This low percentage is because the 2 largest markets for hydroelectric power, China and Brazil, are seeing rising investment costs because there aren't as many sites for hydroelectric power. Every source of energy is expected to rise, including nuclear power, although most of this is into research for nuclear fusion, the opposite of nuclear fission. Nuclear fusion isn't possible right now on Earth, but scientists have proven that it is possible and could be even better as a source of energy than nuclear fission reactors. Even sources of energy we didn't talk about here are expected to rise. Geothermal power is expected to generate 8.5% of the total United States power by 2050. All these numbers are just crazy. The future of energy on Earth is important. We seem to be at the start of a new world. As of today, solar, wind, nuclear, and hydroelectric power are all increasing and will continue to show increased importance in our daily lives. Our entire societies depend on energy, and we started down a path of clean energy. I'm really excited to see what the future energy has in store for us. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you to Pocket for helping me actually edit the script here. And I really hope you guys enjoyed this. I worked really hard on this. Catch you guys next time. Peace.